Welcome. I'm Judith Kelly, Dean of the Stanford School of Public Policy. The Stand For series is organized by our school to help us have a community conversation around things that we care about, such as equity, democracy, justice, and human rights. And today we are focusing specifically on democracy today and tomorrow, where we have another event. And we're so glad that you can join us today. This series is called Stand For because it echoes back to Terry Sanford, the founder of the Stanford School of Public Policy, who said that if you get into politics, you ought to get in with the frame of mind that winning is not everything. And if standing for something defeats you, so be it, he said. Stand for something. And this is surely a time when we all need to ask ourselves, what do we stand for? And so that's why we are together today around the question of democracy. And we're very grateful to the William R. Keenan Jr. Charitable Trust Endowment Fund for supporting this speaker series. The Stanford School mission, our mission is to improve lives and communities through teaching and through research and engagement. And the event today couldn't be more relevant than partnering now with the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy to discuss the state of our country and our democracy. We also hope that you can join us tomorrow for the second part of the Stand For Democracy part of the Stand For series. It'll be at noon tomorrow, and we'll remind you about this later as well. Today, I want to give a warm welcome to Jessica Huseman, who is with us here from ProPublica. Jessica covers voting rights and election administration, and she is the lead reporter for ProPublica's Electionland project. That project helps hundreds of newsrooms across the United States cover ballot access issues in real time. And she's going to be talking today with Bill Adair, who is the director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy right here at the Stanford School. And he's also the Knight Professor of the Duke Initiative, the Knight Professor of the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy, as well as an associate of the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. The DeWitt Wallace Center is Duke University's hub for the study of journalism. And Bill, in particular, focuses on fact-checking and accountability in journalism, as well as the relationship between news and policy. And he created the Pulitzer Prize-winning website, PolitiFact, and is the co-founder of the International Fact-Checking Network. Bill, over to you for this timely discussion.
Thank you so much, Judith. It's great to be doing this tonight. We build this as a fireside chat, and I should note that here at Duke, the outside temperature is 79 degrees, so it's a little warm for a fire. I don't think we have any fires going here in the Sanford building, but we have a hot topic, that's for sure, and so we're thrilled to have Jessica joining us. And before I get started, I just want to tell everyone about some of the things we're doing here in the DeWitt Wallace Center about in covering the election. We have joined ProPublica's Electionland project. We're eager to help and have our student journalists help with the coverage on Election Day. And we have a team of student journalists that work for the 9th Street Journal, which is our local news publication covering Durham. And this year is covering the campaign and the election. And we now have 4 students who are dedicated to covering the election, to issues about mail-in voting, to issues about voter suppression. And these issues are so urgent. And so, Jessica, we're thrilled to have you. So I want to start first by talking a little bit about your background. I think the most interesting thing about your bio is that before you were a journalist, you were a high school teacher and a debate coach. So how did that prepare you for what you do as a journalist now, and particularly as a journalist covering the election?
You know, I think that teaching and journalism are not as different as folks think that they are. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm breaking down for people how something works. So I'm certainly not standing in front of a classroom, although I do that. I teach journalism as well. But I am having to break down concepts that are incredibly complicated, election administration being one of the best examples that I can think of, in a way that people who are not engaged at all with the subject can understand. So if I can keep ninth graders entertained while explaining to them the intricacies of the Mayan infrastructure system, then I am fully confident in my ability to explain election administration in the year 2020, although, you know, maybe we're having some of the same blockage problems, we shall see.
Absolutely. Why don't you tell us a little bit about ProPublica's Election Land Project, the work you do, and some of the things that you'll be doing with news organizations around the country like ours to keep an eye on what's happening in local elections.
Right. So I think that Election Land is very in line with the mission of ProPublica as a nonprofit. So our origins as a nonprofit were that the very smart folks that founded us saw that as local newsrooms were unfortunately shrinking, often the first teams to be gutted were the investigative teams. You know, they're expensive to run, it takes a lot of time. And so they founded ProPublica with the intention that all of our investigations would be Creative Commons licensed so that they could be run by local publications, and that we would partner with local publications to help them do more in-depth coverage that they didn't have the resources to do and we didn't have the local knowledge to do. So it's a really fitting partnership. And so Election Land is basically an extension of that. In 2016, Scott Klein, who is a deputy managing editor at ProPublica, got tired of being the only newsroom in the country that wasn't like eating bad pizza and staying up until 2 o'clock in the morning to like, it's all very exciting and we felt like we were missing out. And so he decided to figure out how we could bring ProPublica's resources to bear in a way that is uniquely ProPublica. And so what we decided to do was a massive data collection effort. And so we get back-end access to, for example, the 1-800-OUR-VOTE hotline, which is run by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and a few other similar organizations that take real-time calls from people at the polls who are having difficulty voting for a number of reasons. And that is, of course, a fire hose of data. And so we hire upwards of 30 freelance journalists for several months around the election to help us go through that. We assign them regions. And so what we do is, because we have the time and the capacity to become experts in election administration, we train our temporary employees to be able to sort out the real problems from the everyday problems that voters face that are not going to inhibit their right to vote. And then we verify that those things are happening and then pass it on to a local reporter so that the local reporter is equipped with real information about how to do their job. And so, you know, it's very different from the way that elections used to be covered in the past. If election administration problems were covered at all, they were covered the next day, way after folks at that precinct would have the opportunity to correct the problem and cast a ballot. And so we tried to flip that on its head and give them the information in enough time that we could shine light on the problem and have that problem be fixed in time for those folks to vote.
So you mentioned something I think is an important distinction, and that is the difference between the everyday problems that occur in elections and the real problems. We were talking about that today with one of our student journalists who is doing a mail-in ballot and having it's a slow process. And we were talking about how normal is this? How do we, both as journalists, but also as voters, know like what's just part of the usual bureaucratic process? And at what point is there really something to be alarmed about?
That's a really good question. And I think that it's one that I struggled with when I started to cover election administration and ballot access 4 years ago. And I think that the answer is that in order to be an effective voter, an effective participant in democracy, you really have to become familiar with your county's standards. And if you know those standards and you understand those standards, then you're going to be very empowered. But I also think that it's important to understand that a lot of places do not have the ability to they do not have the ability to sort of give you real-time information because they are overloaded with concerns of their own. And so having access to resources that are outside of your county that you can consult for help or understanding for how to navigate a problem through. For example, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law 888 Our Vote is a great resource. It's constantly staffed with attorneys that can answer questions for you and help you figure out if the problem you're experiencing is just sort of normal bureaucratic mess or something a little bit more. And so I think just familiarizing yourself with those resources is going to be key.
Cool. So I think just in the last couple of weeks, a lot of us have awakened to the realization about what November and maybe December might be like. The Atlantic piece that Bart Gellman wrote presented a real nightmarish, just frightening scenario of what might happen. And then Tom Friedman's column in the New York Times this week, he wrote, "Our democracy is in terrible danger, more danger than it has been since the Civil War, more danger than after Pearl Harbor, more danger than during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and more danger than during Watergate." Do you think the danger is that great? Is the situation that dire?
You know, that's a really difficult question to answer. I think that in a lot of respects, we will not know the answer to that question until November 4th. But I think that the possibility of those things exists. I think I have a little bit of a different perspective than both of those gentlemen because I spend most of my day talking to county clerks. And those are the folks that are really responsible for making sure that you get your ballot, making sure that your ballot is processed on time. There is very little that the federal government or even state governments in most places have to do with the actual administration of elections. And so in that sense, I don't think that it's going to be a countrywide disaster. I have spoken in the last 4 years to upwards of 300 county clerks, and I can count on less than one hand the number of county clerks who I thought did not want to do their job well. And so as long as those people are doing their job well and doing their job competently, then November 4th will come and the sun will rise and we will all be fine. But, you know, I think that there are structural problems that states have set in place. So just hours ago in Texas, Greg Abbott inexplicably announced that there would only be one drop box per county for mail-in ballots. And so Harris County is larger in population than most states that will only have one drop-off box. There are counties in Texas that take up more square mileage than the state of New Hampshire and Delaware combined, and they will only have one drop box. And I cannot imagine the hysterics that would come down if Delaware were to announce that they only have one drop box in the entire state. And so there are these structural difficulties, but I think that in an odd kind of perverse way, they have prepared Americans to avert that disaster entirely. In 2016 and 2018, as I was covering those federal elections, it was not common for me to call people and ask for their plan to vote and have that plan be, I already have my ballot in my hand and I'm casting it right this second. Folks are much more savvy now because of all of the complete chaos that has been wrought at the federal level, true or otherwise. And I think that Americans are prepared to help election administrators pull this election off in unprecedented times.
You and other reporters at ProPublica have written about all sorts of different problems, from vote by mail to vulnerable email at elections offices to problems in the governance of elections. Is there one problem in particular that keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I think, so this is not so much a problem as it is kind of an inherent feature in American democracy, which is that every state does things very differently. And the lack of understanding of how states work will lead to the ability for people who want to create chaos after Election Day. So let me just give you a couple of examples. Delaware is the first state to certify its election results, and that happens on November 5th. California is the last, and that does not happen until December 11th. That is not a new feature. That is something that has always been the case. We never know the actual results of the election on November 4th or the night of November 3rd. Those results are certified much, much later. But I think that there's a real lack of understanding for how that works. And I also think that that the activists that have sprung up around vote by mail have not done a very good job of helping people understand the widely varying requirements for each state to vote by mail. I think that your average person who votes by mail thinks, well, as long as my ballot is postmarked by Election Day, it will be counted. That is not true in every state. There are states that require your ballot to be postmarked the day before Election Day. There are states that require your ballot to be received the day before Election Day. And so I think that my worry is that American voters feel strongly that each state treats things the same, and they really do not, and that they will go with the lack of nuance in news coverage that they see as instructive for how they should file their ballots.
Now, that decentralized system has its strengths in that there's no single computer system, there's no single office, there's no single tallying for the entire country, and in fact, it's even decentralized within states. So that has its strengths, but it also has its weaknesses, right? Because you have a lot of the election is being run out of, in most cases, county offices that are very small and that are vulnerable to things like hacking, as you pointed out in your article about the Texas incident recently. And that's where they could sow the chaos.
I think that they could. And I think that what is really important for folks to know is that it is much easier to suggest the possibility of a problem through misinformation than it is to actually cause one. So that's two sides of the same coin, as you just mentioned. So it's very difficult to hack American democracy or voting systems en masse. It would be very difficult to do that with more than one county or even within a county, because the systems are more or less effectively firewalled against each other. That's not to say that it can't happen, it's just a small possibility. But what could happen is exactly what happened last week in Hamilton County, Texas, which is something that my team covered pretty extensively. It was kind of an accident that we found out to begin with. One of our reporters, Derek Willis, runs his own nonprofit that collects precinct level election data. And he sent Hamilton County a pretty standard records request as part of that work and received malware back. And the malware was isolated and it was not aimed at doing extreme damage. It was just meant to scan email addresses and look for valuable information. This same type of, phishing and spoofing that happens to people every single day. There's really no possibility that it could affect the voter registration system. But if I'm a resident of Hamilton County and I email the clerk in that county and what I get back is an absentee ballot application, but also malware that shuts down my email, I think that I'm probably going to be pretty concerned about the validity of the results that county is able to produce at the end of the day, even if those two problems are unrelated. And so I think that there's a much wider, there's a much wider sort of concept of state infrastructure that's misunderstood by citizens, but we're not going to correct that knowledge, right? The best thing that we can do is make sure every single system is secure so that there isn't even the appearance of impropriety.
So you raise the challenge of sort of putting things in perspective. And I thought of this, the first speaker in my advanced reporting class was the chair of our State Board of Elections, Damon Circosta. Oh. And he, and after he spoke, I said that he had given me in particular, a real sense of calm about the election. Like, they got this. And after hearing how he talked about the election, I really felt confident that the North Carolina system was being well run, that they were ready, that they were worried about the right things, they were tracking things. But in the meantime, now we have a president who is cherry picking isolated things, including some in North Carolina, where making big deals about things that don't warrant making a big deal about, suggesting fraud when there is no evidence of fraud. And what's missing in the national conversation is that voice of calm. Is anyone saying, okay, let's put this in perspective? So in the way that we're having this conversation, I'm coming away thinking, okay, one of the top reporters covering the election has a good sense because you've been spending the last many months looking into this, and you have a sense of how things are being run. But who is the voice who's going to speak up and say, this is how it works and this is going okay? Instead, we're going to hear all of this, all of these false things. And I just wonder how we get the accurate message out. And maybe is that the journalist's responsibility? Is that the State Board of Elections responsibility?
I think it's all of the above. I think that, there's this fascinating thing that takes place in, certainly in my career as a teacher, but also my career as a journalist. And I'm sure there are about 100 other careers that this applies to as well, because people went to school, they think that they know how teaching works. And because people occasionally vote, they think that they know how voting works. And because they occasionally mail things, they think that they know how vote by mail works, right? And so there is a knowledge gap there that people aren't aware of. And so it allows people like the president to take little seeds of misinformation that seem logical and insert it into that cavity and complete people's knowledge of this event. And you're right, every single time I go and talk to a concerned voter and I show them exactly step by step how the process works, it assuages a lot of their fears. The problem is that every county works in a totally different way. And so it's almost impossible to have a national cohesive voice explaining how voting works. The only national cohesive thing that we can say is voting is going to be fine. And so I think that, state boards of election and the county clerk's offices are so deeply underfunded and ignored that the education campaigns that they do are frequently deeply ineffective. You saw that in Texas in 2016, Missouri in 2018. They both implemented voter ID laws, and the state didn't even have enough money to teach people how to comply with their own law. So then asking the state to be more proactive about explaining how the process works when, frankly, the problem is inside of the House in a lot of these state legislatures that are assigning budgets to these offices. It's a tall order. And so I think that the only arm left that has the capacity to do that is the media. And I have encouraged the media in a number of trainings, probably more than 35 in the last 4 years, as I've trained other journalists on how to cover election administration, that we are not neutral observers of the election. We are not neutral observers of voting. We are active participants in it because the Board of Elections are, for whatever reason, not doing this work. And your average person probably doesn't even know that the Secretary of State's office manages elections. They probably also have no idea that their county clerk's office has a bunch of information on their website. They're going to turn on the local news at night. They're going to log on to their favorite local newspaper's website. And if that information is not there for them in a cogent, easy to explain way, then I think that we've really failed at our jobs of helping to sustain democracy.
But there's also the impulse that we have as journalists to expose things that are broken. So if mail-in ballots are not working well, and you've had stories like this, we want to expose those things. And the collective of those individual stories can make it look like the whole system is broken and feed into the propaganda that the whole, that, oh my God, this election's just rife with fraud, And
Yes.
so, and it's interesting, and it's interesting to hear you talk about our role, because and I think that this has been true for my students, is we're sort of realizing that covering this election is definitely unlike covering the campaigns.
Yes, it's very different. And I think that that problem that you point out is not unique to election journalists. I give a presentation to my class at Columbia Journalism School every year that shows people how numbers can be easily taken out of context. So, for example, it is not a mistake that parents believe that if they let their child play in the front yard, their child will be immediately kidnapped. It is not a mistake that there is an entire industry that has built itself up around the likelihood that a shooter busts into your child's school. So maybe you're buying your child a bulletproof backpack, when statistically those things are deeply unlikely to take place. And we are all over preparing and scared of nothing. And I think that in many ways is how voting is covered in the United States. And so it leaves people with the impression that voter suppression is this unshakable force, and that laws that hamper the ability to vote will absolutely impact most people, or that Trump supporters with megaphones and guns are definitely going to be standing in front of your polling place in suburban Milwaukee. Like, those things are deeply unlikely to happen. The vast majority of American voters will go to the polls and will have a fine time. And so it is true that we cover the problems, not necessarily when things go right as they should, but I think that we need to flip that on its head a little bit, because the problem with American democracy right now is not that it doesn't work, but that people think it doesn't. And so if we're going to solve that problem, then the way that we cover voting needs to change. And the objects that we tackle in that coverage need to change, and we need to flip it to critiquing the false statements of politicians, which are just as problematic as actual problems in the election system. And if we did that, then we would have just endless amounts of topics to cover. So I think that it is true that we need to cover the problems. I just think that we're really focused on the wrong ones.
That's great. All right. I want to follow up on something you just said, but first I want to just say to our audience, we'd love to have your questions. If you will just click in the Q&A box there on the bottom of the screen, and you can type a question in, and I will ask Jessica. So you mentioned the poll watchers and whether they're going to show up with guns. So you've seen the now famous video posted on Facebook and Twitter by Donald Trump Jr., which was sort of a call to arms. But if you click it, it leads you to just kind of an election day sign up to help get out the vote sign up page. What do you make of that? Is it just using a screaming headline to get people to sign up? Or is it going to lead to people intimidating voters at the polls, like we saw, at least to some extent, in Fairfax, Virginia, a week or two ago?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that it's important to frame that in the context of history a little bit. So in 2016, Roger Stone did the same thing, subbing in for Donald Trump Jr. here. A couple of weeks before the election, he put out this mass call for election workers, and he was going to train them, and he was going to assign them to what he called problematic, but were really just brown polling locations. And that didn't happen because there are very clear guidelines for who can be a poll watcher and who can't in every single state. You have to be trained, you have to be registered. You do not register with a campaign, you register with a party. So I would be much more worried if this were an official outreach from the RNC or from local Republican parties, but it is instead coming from the Trump campaign. And so clerks are not new at this, right? There are always people every year that try to cause chaos at the polls. Clerks know how to deal with it. I think that part of the incentive to do a campaign of the one that Donald Trump Jr. did, although typically the spokespersons sound a little bit more sober, I don't know, than he did in that video, or at least a little bit more menacing, I don't know. They're mostly just an effort to rile up the base. And what they always end up being is just ways to collect more emails. So I signed up to be a Donald Trump poll watcher in 2016. I signed up again this year. I have not gotten any communication whatsoever that suggests that I'm going to be called to present with my gun at my local Dallas polling station. And I'm sure that this community is one that they would like to send poll watchers to. Like, there's just not enough time. Like, if they had started collecting these names and signing folks up to be poll watchers and do that training and register with a local county in early June, then I would be very alarmed. But there's just not enough time to do it. It seems to me like a last-ditch effort to send out fundraising emails rather than to actually organize some cohesive intimidation strategy. I mean, but the strategy itself could be the point, right? Donald Trump does this a lot. He says very threatening things. He makes it seem like he's going to deport a bunch of immigrants or change immigration laws in very significant ways. And sort of like that's the feature, not the bug. Like the point of the campaign is not actually doing it, but just saying that you will. And so I think that it's important for journalists and for local elections officials to be very clear about what the requirements to be a poll watcher are. And I have been sort of optimistic about that and have seen secretaries of state and elections directors of both parties clearly laying that out on social media and local news stations, and I hope that continues.
So in terms of putting things in perspective, help us with a couple of things regarding all the coverage we've seen on mail-in ballots. First, we've seen in the last few weeks many news organizations testing the mail, mailing a bunch of things, and just seeing how quickly they get where they should go. And in general, the latest one here in North Carolina was pretty encouraging. Most of the stuff got there pretty quickly. In fact, the overwhelming majority did, but some things didn't. And I think that's been my sense of all the other tests I've seen is that, for the most part, it got there when it should. A few things didn't. What's your sense of and the New York Times has done some good coverage looking at mail volume about, can they handle a big surge of volume of absentee ballots? And that seems like the Postal Service can. What's your sense of all that? Because the hype would lead us to believe, oh my God, I'm going to mail it on October 15th and it'll get there for Christmas,
Yeah, so I don't want to speak ill of local news organizations, but those tests are just incredibly flawed and not at all indicative of how and when your mail will arrive. And there are lots of reasons for that. Specifically, there are very specific standards for how mail from elections offices is treated that is different from regular flat parcel mail. So they can test the system all they want, but unless they break the law, they can't put the county election administrator's seal on that envelope. And so the tests are flawed from the beginning. And then also, the reason that they are treated differently is because counties have very specific agreements with the vote by mail vendors and also the post office that sends out their mail. So the post office scans ballots and then the ballots they're contained in very specific ways. They scan all letters in very specific ways. And county clerks and states have been able to design the envelopes so as to be most efficiently processed by the system. So for example, the USPS scans ballots and uses optical character recognition to sort them. And they start from the bottom right of the envelope and then they scan up and down and up and down and up and down. And so if you design your envelopes to be easily read exactly how the post office in your local area sorts mail, then that mail is going to get through faster. I don't know what kind of reporting these folks did, but I don't think that it was probably, hey, how does your scanning system work so that we can design a perfect envelope, right? But county clerks do think about those things. And so those things are treated very differently. And they also have fail safes within the system to make sure that election ballots are treated differently than other mail. So the counties that do this the most effectively will color code their envelopes so that mail carriers know, like, oh, the envelope is purple, this is going to a voter. Okay, this envelope is red, it's going back to the elections office. So postal workers are aware of what ballots are. They are not aware of what like random envelopes sent by Channel 4 are. And so, you know, I mean, it's just a bit different. And so I think that, you know, I do have some mild concerns about the USPS. The volume is down. I think much more helpful for voters to understand the volume and capacity of mail is the type of data analysis that the New York Times has done. ProPublica analyze, we get almost daily data pushes from the USPS on volume, and we monitor it to make sure that it doesn't go out of balance. And our intention is to not give it any attention at all unless it does, just to avoid any misconceptions of how to use the data. But what the data shows is essentially that the way that the USPS has operated during the pandemic is not much different than it operated before. The vast majority of mail gets delivered on time, and the areas where we've seen the biggest slowdowns are not areas where they're overloaded with flat parcels, but instead areas where the USPS was hit by COVID and they did not have an appropriate plan to substitute those letter carriers in. And so that continues to be an issue, right? That COVID isn't going away, and it's certainly not going to go away before November 3rd. Ballots are already being mailed back. And I think that another really important thing to consider is that the most mail-in ballots that I think that we're going to see is about 100 million. And that is a fraction of the mail that the USPS delivers in a day. And those 100 million ballots are not going to be sent back in one day. I think that people have this concept that election day happens on November 3rd, and that's when everybody votes. But that's not true. More than 1 million people have already cast their ballots because they can start voting early. They can mail those ballots in as they get them. This is not going to be a huge stressor on the USPS. This is at most going to be a little blip on the radar. And if people need something to compare it to, they should think about how much political mail they've really received in the last week. I bet it's about 4 or 5 pieces of political mail, right? But you're only going to get one ballot, and you're only going to send one ballot back. So if you're getting your political mail, your ballot's going to be just fine.
That's a great measurement. Let me make one more plea for more questions. Love to see more questions. Just click in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll go to your questions. So, speaking of the Postal Service, a lot of focus on Louis DeJoy. He has really been portrayed as a villain in all this. And yet, I think after he testified before Congress, as I started to tease it out, it made me wonder how much, to the extent that there are slowdowns in various facilities around the country, how much he's responsible for those versus how much Congress is responsible for those, for basically saddling the Postal Service with this huge obligation and then forcing the Postal Service to have to make these difficult budgetary decisions.
Yes.
So what's your sense of his role? Is he the villain that he's been made out to be?
Sure. You know, I mean, Mr. DeJoy has made some strange choices, but the post office is not where the post office is because Louis DeJoy has been in office for a few months. Like, the post office is where the post office is because Congress started messing with it in the 1970s when Nixon decided that it should be a for-profit institution, right? And it's all just gone downhill from there. So in the mid-2000s, in addition to it also being transformed into this concept that the USPS should be inherently profitable on its own, they also required it to prepay retirement packages 75 years in advance. And so on one hand, you hear the post office needs to act like a private business. And then on the other hand, you hear please fund your retirement 75 years in advance, which is not something any private company would ever be expected to do, and is ludicrous that the USPS is required to do it. And in fact, if you subtracted the payments that they have to make in order to comply with that 75-year commitment, they would actually be slightly profitable. But I think that the concept that the USPS should be profitable is inherently problematic, right? Like, this was something that was established in the Constitution as a way to bind America together. And I don't think that people really understand the post office history as a vehicle for communication. So, for example, at the very origins of the post office, most of the postmaster generals and postmasters for local areas were newspapermen, right? That's why Ben Franklin was a postmaster, because he ran a printing press. And so not only did he get to distribute the mail, he also got to distribute the news, right? Like, that is what bound America together. That is what gave us all the same access to information. And so now I think that people don't think that we really need the post office, because we've got the internet, and we've got FedEx, and we've got DHL, and we've got all these other things. But let me tell you what, as a former resident of rural America, those things would not bind me to the rest of the country, right? We have whole swaths of this country. I still own property in an area in which the only place that will deliver down the private dirt road that goes to my gate is the USPS. Amazon is not getting my package to me in 2 days, okay? So, like, if we did away with the post office, if we required it to be a service, then rural America would really suffer for that. We would not get payments. We would not get medication. We would not get basic necessities. And to the extent that Louis DeJoy has made that more difficult, it is because of the policy decisions that he has implemented. I think people are very, very focused on the removal of the blue mailboxes and the removal of sorting devices. Those decisions were made long before Louis DeJoy got into office, and were in fact just necessary growing pains, because nobody uses the blue post boxes, and also they're sorting a lot more packages than they are letters. But what is concerning is his cutting of overtime and the policy changes that he has implemented. He has said that he's going to stop that ahead of the election to avoid any appearance of impropriety. But I think even going forward after the election, the mail is such a critical part to so many people in America that we should still keep an eye on those policy choices.
Cool. All right, to some questions. Great one from Jen Alexander. Which state or states do you think handle voting by mail the best, and why?
This is a really easy answer. So the 3 best states for vote by mail are Washington, Colorado, and Utah. And that, I'm sorry, no, I'm going to change that. I think Oregon is just a little bit better than Utah. Oregon's been doing this for a really, really long time. And so is Washington, and to a lesser extent, Colorado. And then also Hawaii and Utah also now universally vote by mail, and they're getting there, but their processes are just not as refined as the other 3 states. These states have universal vote by mail. They've got excellent security measures in place. Their voter education is outstanding because they can do it at the state level, because they've sort of made voting very uniform across the state. They've also got the best devices to sort and open and mail envelopes. They have perfected their supply chain needs. So while lots of other states are scrambling to get like the right type of envelopes from the not very large big envelope like conglomeration, these states have had that contract for years and years and years. They are having to change very little to accommodate the pandemic. And where we see mistakes being made always is when states make changes at all, but especially when states make changes too fast. So those 5 states that have been doing this and doing it for a while are going to be just fine, and have in fact been very useful models for the rest of the country.
While we're talking about states, here's a fun question from Scott Whiteman. Does any place in the country still use CHADS?
No, they do not. Thank God. That was a really easy question for me to answer. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 set minimum standards for voting machines, and most states have adopted those minimum standards. Mississippi hasn't, which is a whole other conversation, which I don't think is as problematic as other people think that it is, but I can assure you that there are no CHAD ballots in Mississippi or elsewhere.
All right, here's one. Speaking of Chads from Florida, from Gina Presson, who's one of our alums in Florida, who teaches journalism there. President Trump made a comment last week that if governors believed there was fraud in their state vote count, that the governor could decide to assign electoral college votes as they saw fit. Is there any validity to this comment? Now, this may be one where we need to bring in a constitutional lawyer. But
yeah, we may need to, but I have never heard of anything like that. So I think like I would bet quite a bit of my savings, maybe not all, that's probably not true, but I'm probably not your best resource for that one.
We'll double check that with Walter Dellinger.
Okay, good.
Okay, Kathy Clabby, who teaches with us here in the DeWitt Wallace Center, asks, is there newish technology that you expect will help the accuracy and speed of vote counting this year?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing, I mean, so I think accuracy and speed are kind of opposite things, right? So we can have a fast election, or we can have an election that runs well, but we can't really have both. So I think that the things that I am most excited about are things that are not very fast, but will ensure accuracy. So believe it or not, like given the, very angry people who exist in this voting space, more than 90% of the country ends up voting on a paper ballot, whether that is because you are physically casting your ballot on paper or using a ballot marking device that then prints out paper for you to review and then cast. The vast majority of elections are done on paper. There are only a handful of counties that still use paperless machines. And because of that, because of the radical shift towards paper backups, counties are much more likely to implement what is called a risk limiting audit, which is a very complicated mathematical scheme that makes sure that takes a random sample of ballots and makes sure that the results of the election were accurately counted based on the intent of the voter. And that has really improved things. The other thing, and this is not a specific technology, but is really important, the states have a much better relationship with the federal government as it relates to elections than they once did. So when I first started covering elections in 2016, I would go, and I know this sounds thrilling, to the National Association of Secretaries of State conference twice a year. It was very fun, and nerd out with other election nerds, and it was great. But in 2016, when I went to my first one in Indianapolis, DHS did a private briefing and they were at each other's throats. Like they hated DHS, was not confident in their ability to fix anything. And in 4 years, that relationship, like, I don't know what kind of marital counseling they did, but their relationship is rock solid now. And I think DHS has offered so many more really reliable resources for local counties, penetration tests, security analysis, phishing tests. They will help counties migrate onto .gov, which is much more secure. And so I think since 2016, sort of behind the scenes, the government, without saying much of anything to the public, has really readied itself in a way that I don't think that they've readied itself for previous federal elections. And I'm really hopeful about that.
There's a theme to many of your answers, and that theme is reporting. You are an expert in this because you've spent the time and getting to know these people, talking to these people, the people in the trenches who are really doing this, and then writing and leading more informed coverage. And you alluded to, the sort of quickie, let's do a quick hit story, but there's no substitute for great reporting. And what's so sad, I was reading a report today by my night chair colleague at UNC, the decline of journalism around the country. There's so fewer reporters, so there are fewer people like you able to do that and invest that time to become an expert. So it's heartening to hear that you've done all this and that you have nerded out with the secretaries of state and all the clerks. It's what we need are more journalists who can do that.
Well, I think that's a really great point. And a large part of the purpose of Election Land is to help other journalists do that with the understanding that they have basically no time, right? Like the same journalist that is covering election administration is also covering City Hall and probably the campaigns and maybe also this, like the education board, right? So they don't have time to like become best friends with a local clerk or sort out like the good tips from the bad tips, which is why we're trying to kind of streamline everything and only raise things to local journalists that really require coverage so that they're not distracted by all of the other stuff. And so we can't solve that entire problem, but I think that if election journalists or campaign journalists or political journalists or whatever they're called at their newsroom take the time to join Election Land and let us feed them information, then they'll find it a lot easier to do this in-depth reporting because we just come to them with the resources that are already at our disposal.
Sure. So here's a related question from Phil Zeidman. Phil is a great supporter of the DeWitt Wallace Center, supports our colloquium after each election. Have you seen evidence of publishers urging that the news staff exercise restraint in reporting isolated examples of problems, not lending currency to alarmists and conspiracy theorists?
That is certainly a message that we send in every training that we do. We do a lot of partnering with an organization called First Draft, which specializes in combating mis and disinformation. And a lot of that is very hand in hand with election coverage. I think that local papers are getting smarter at the disinformation game. I don't think that they are perfect at it yet. I think that I see a lot of really breathless coverage of really basic election administration problems. But on the other hand, I think that local reporters do a much better job of this than national reporters. And I will give you a couple of examples, right? The way that the very bizarre press release from the DOJ about like 9 ballots thrown in the trash in Pennsylvania was covered by the national media was way more breathless than the local media there that took a step back and tried to figure out what really happened. And, you know, in Kentucky, when there were all of this social rampage with the hashtag Eyes on Kentucky that LeBron James was tweeting out, that Ilhan Omar was tweeting out, I think Oprah even tweeted it out, just outraged that there were 600,000 voters assigned to like one polling location in Louisville, when in fact that wasn't true at all. It was a massive convention center. There were multiple precincts inside that convention center, and more than a third of the people who were expected to cast a ballot already had through vote by mail. So we're talking about a much smaller number of people being bused for free to one location to vote in a socially distanced space. There were no lines all day. And so that was really the case. That was really a case of the national media spinning something into a problem, while the local reporters, including ones I've worked with, I did a whole series on Kentucky elections with the Lexington Herald Leader a couple of years ago, were just sort of like shouting from their newsrooms that it wasn't as bad as people were making it seem. So I think that I have more faith in local coverage than I do national, which is probably mean for me to say as a national reporter, but it's what I believe.
I'm heartened personally to hear that. All right, here's a great question by one of our student reporters who's covering the election, Rose Wong. She asks, how do you plan to vote in this election?
Well, I live in Texas, so I will be voting in person, probably on the 3rd day of early voting, because statistics show, I know this is such a nerdy thing to say, but statistics show that the time that the polls are least active is on the 3rd day of early voting in Texas. And so that is when I will be going. And, I think that this election is so interesting because, the places like Texas get a lot of very well-deserved flack for the things that they do for voting, but let me tell you what, there are not that many states that have a full month of early voting, and Texas almost has a full month of early voting. So if I can't vote on the 3rd day, I've got like 20 others to choose from, and I'm pretty excited about that, but I do have to go in person, and so that's what I'll be doing.
Gotcha. Okay, another big populous southern state, Florida. Sylvia Thompson asks, is there anything we learned from the Florida recount in 2000 or even in the last election that might apply in this election? Do you think Florida is in good shape to do an accurate count?
I think that most counties in Florida are in good shape to do an accurate count. I think that, like in many states, the problems faced in Florida generally come down to one or two counties that are just very problematic and always have been. Broward County, for whatever reason, has been a disaster for decades. Fulton County, Georgia, disaster for decades. Frankly, the New York City Board of Elections, disaster for a century. So, I think that it's hard to answer on a whole state basis, but I think generally Florida has done what it needed to do. And Florida is fortunate because it is one of the states that has allowed no excuse absentee ballots for a long time. People in Florida can cast their ballot by mail for any reason, and that has been the case for quite some time. So the education gap that needs to happen to make voters prepared to effectively vote by mail is much smaller in a state like Florida. The same is true for states like Arizona and New Jersey and other places where you could always vote by mail absentee. They also have a little bit more leeway in terms of when the registrars there can begin opening and processing ballots, which is going to allow them to count the ballots much more quickly. They also usually have the equipment that they need to do it. So they're very different than a state like Wisconsin, which does not allow clerks to begin processing ballots until 7 a.m. the morning of the election, which is wild. And, they're not doing that by hand. They've got the technology that they need to do it. So I'm pretty optimistic about Florida. It's frankly, it's one of the states that I'm worried least about, which is something that I never thought I would say about the state of Florida, but here we are in unprecedented times.
You bet. So we got time for one more question. This comes from someone that's got posted in the Q&A, but it doesn't have a name associated with it. Somewhat relevant to the question about reporting. Unfortunately, good reporting is not always the case, and sometimes poor and misleading reporting is even intentional. As a former high school teacher, what's your perspective on teaching media literacy practices and tools to students?
Yeah, it's so interesting that you asked me that question because, I taught ninth grade world history, but I also taught speech and debate. And speech and debate is an evidence-based academic exercise that is entirely almost based on news coverage. And so teaching news literacy as part of that course was basically a necessity. And I think that if you give students the tools to sort out what seems fake and what seems real, then they do that very well. The problem is that in order to make those logical conclusions, you have to have an underlying knowledge of the subject matter. It's very difficult to tell fact from fiction when you don't have any context for which to take in that information, right? If you have no schema for some different piece of information, you're not going to be able to accept it and process it in a way that you would normally process other things. And so I think what is crucially important about news literacy is improved civic education in the United States. And if we were to arm students with that baseline of knowledge, then teaching news literacy would be a lot easier. There are great resources out there. PBS, the New York Times, both have resources for high school and middle school age students. And then there's also a new nonprofit called the News Literacy Project that produces free resources for teachers to help students sort of sort this out. But, this type of critical thinking is not new for American education systems. Like, I think that you probably all remember doing a DBQ, right? Or like a document-based question essay. That's just sorting fact from fiction and applying it to an essay. And so we just need to, I think, in American education, think more structurally about the news as a primary source of information. And I don't know that I just don't know that switch has been flipped yet.
You bet. Well, this has really been enlightening. I've just really enjoyed this conversation, learned a lot. Really want to thank you for taking time to talk with us. And I want to encourage the audience. This conversation continues tomorrow at noon with some of our faculty members. Judith is going to lead it, and I think it's Phil Napoli, Deandra Rose, and Mac McCorkle, if I remember correctly. So please join us for that. If you didn't, the link should be in your email. If not, you can find it on the Sanford website. Again, Jessica, thank you so much. This has been just marvelous. Thanks for taking the time. You've given us confidence in all this, and also help in sorting out some of the hype about this crazy moment. So
I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
I'm gonna sleep well tonight.
Oh, good. That's my goal, really. I don't sleep well. So if I can make other people sleep well, then I think it balances out, right?
All right. Thank you so much. Thank
you.
you to everyone for joining us, and hope to see everybody tomorrow. So long.